Hi everyone, and welcome to the Hitchhiker's Guide to Digital Methods for Book History. My name is Lena Slock, and I am a DPhil candidate in education here in Oxford. And last year I was an MST student in modern languages looking at the European Enlightenment, and I got a chance to take history of the book with Professor Leinemann. So today's presentation is inspired in part by the work I got to do in the history of the book course and by the questions that ultimately brought me to the field of education, where I'm looking at the integration of digital methods into humanistic teaching, learning, and research. So I just wanted to point out why I thought this title slide was so cool. It's a great visual metaphor of two distinct phenomena coming together to create something beautiful. And it's one of the ways in which I envision the digital humanities. So for today's discussion, we're going to be looking at the transformation of physical objects, or analog, if you want, into digital artifacts. So before we begin, I would like to establish a baseline definition of the digital humanities. And as we go through this presentation, I'm going to be throwing some open-ended questions at you to help you think more critically about these issues and also to start thinking about how they relate to your work for the course and how you might incorporate some of these concepts and methods. So I'd like for you to think about, what do you associate with the digital humanities? You might know of certain methods or techniques, or perhaps you've heard of projects at your undergraduate alma mater or here in Oxford, or maybe you even know of people doing DH work. And then think about, how would you yourself define the digital humanities? And I'm going to offer the way I would define it, which is the use of digital tools to facilitate traditional humanistic inquiry in new ways. So there's a couple of big takeaways from this definition. The first is that the digital humanities are not, in fact, a discipline, but rather a set of digitally driven methodologies. And we use these methodologies to aid and enhance traditional humanistic scholarship. And I use aid or facilitate here because that humanistic scholarship is the starting point as well as the end goal. So we begin a digital humanities project with a traditional question, and we end it with a traditional answer, but one that has been innovated upon through these methods. And I say innovate because we use these methods not necessarily to be trendy or cool, but because they can help us uncover or to see something new that we couldn't have seen without them. And we're going to look at a few examples of where we got to do just that. And I've used the word tools here in the plural because there's just so many. Anything from databases to social media, which actually we'll be talking about both of those during this conversation. So we're going to have a quick stop around the world in three parts, looking specifically at book history projects. And what I'm hoping you'll see is that book history is an area that is rich for exploration with digital methods, partly because we're working with already some kind of technology, whether it's the creation of a manuscript or the printing press. And now with our own methodologies, we're using digital technology to take a new look at these objects. And what I'm hoping you'll also see is that there are a couple of examples already, and that there are many more projects out there in book history that can hopefully inspire you as you work on your projects for this course. So we're going to be, as we go through this discussion, looking at particular questions, and I'm also going to suggest a few activities that you could do as you're watching. So if you've got your object in front of you, that's great, or maybe you'll go back to special collections at some point and take your notes with you and do some of these activities on your own. So I'd like to begin with the project that actually got me into the field of digital humanities. And it's this catalog of 1,166 pages. And if we were in a classroom, you would see that this is like a brick of a book. It's huge. And it's a catalog of the library of Voltaire, who was a French Enlightenment philosophe. And the funky thing about this catalog is that it was produced by the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg in the early to mid-20th century. You might be thinking that is a world away from Voltaire. But the story actually is that Catherine the Great of Russia purchased Voltaire's library as well as the library of his fellow philosophe Diderot as monuments to the Enlightenment, and she had them brought to St. Petersburg, where they remain to this day, with the exception of Diderot's library, but that's another fascinating story. So if we were looking at this book in person, you would see that there's a couple of issues in terms of working with it. The first is that it's not necessarily portable, because it's quite huge. And the second is that it's not the most user-friendly book. One reason for why that's the case is because many of the editor's notes, as we'll see, are in Russian. And that's not a language that's typically taught in Enlightenment studies. But even putting that aside, many of the book titles still are in French or German or Italian. The trouble is that you still have to search through 1,166 alphabetized pages. And it's not the most efficient way of looking for these texts, and it's also not a great way to get a bird's eye view of what it was that Voltaire was reading. So you'd really only get one or two titles of perspective. So what we're going to do right now is look at a random page from the catalog, and we're going to practice reading this with an eye to data. And by data, I really just mean pieces of information. So the first question we could ask when looking at this is a really simple one. What kinds of data are present? So the first thing that we've got here is the title of the book. And then we've got a line that denotes the author. So in the previous pages, you would actually see the author who wrote all of the books on this catalog page with lines next to them. So they didn't reprint the author every time, they just denote them with a line. So we've got the author, we've got the place and date of publication. For books that were censored, it would just say SI 1768, so sine loco, without place. We've got the number of pages, and what you'll see here is that the number of pages is noted in Russian, 31 straniцы. So if you don't know that, you might be a little bit confused. We've also got the presumably width of the book, 19 centimeters, as well as the collection into which Voltaire himself grouped it. And we know that because he had like little sticky notes on the spine of the book. And then we've got the number of the book in the Vernet catalog, which was produced either during Voltaire's lifetime or shortly thereafter. And Vernet refers to his chateau just outside Geneva, where the library was held before it was brought to St. Petersburg. And then just below we have the editor's notes. So in Russian it says podpisi, meaning signatures. So these are the signatures of people in the book. Perhaps it's the people who gifted it to him. That's, another topic of exploration. So what I'd like for you to do is, if you've got your book in front of you, is to open it to the frontispiece and to ask yourself, what data can you identify from the title page of your book? And then once you've got that, so looking for things like title, any people who are involved, so we would call that prosopographical data, referring to people like authors, editors, commenters, publishers, booksellers. In early modern books, you should be able to find that towards the bottom. You might also find the printer's mark in the center of the page, looking for place and date of publication, looking for any marks of censorship that might indicate the absence of a particular kind of data. And once you've found those, think about what kinds of questions can I ask about that data. So for example, with these signatures, I wanted to know, how did those signatures end up in the book? Do they indicate people who are gifting Voltaire certain kinds of texts? So you might be asking, well, that's all well and good, but why are we going to use a digital approach to deal with this? The trouble with this is that we have this data for almost 7,000 books, precisely 6,763, which is a lot. Now, of course, not every book has the same level of detail, but a catalog is a wonderful way of getting that bird's eye view of somebody's library. So the traditional humanistic question that I began with was, what did Voltaire read? It is in itself a simple question insofar as it doesn't denote any kind of methodology, but then you find the source material on what he was reading and you think, I might have to employ something a bit different to get an answer to that question. So I have identified, as you saw, a number of different data points. We have the prosopographical, we have the geographical, so place of publication, we have temporal, in the date of publication, and bibliographical. And in your case, you might be dealing with one book rather than a whole corpus, and we'll eventually look at an example of an individual book. But what I'm hoping you've seen here is that you can already start asking questions of the data and finding that the answers to those questions might be found through unconventional methods. So, a few questions for you to think about here. What I had to do then was think about how can I transform this catalog into something I can use to actually answer my question. And what you see in front of you is the transformation of this physical object into a digital artifact. And I was lucky enough that the catalog was in PDF form, because it would have been a pain to scan all of it. But in your case, what we're going to be doing eventually is taking photographs, which are a good first step. So in my case, what I did first was take the PDF and run it through a process called optical character recognition, and more commonly known as OCR. And that's essentially a fancy way of saying it can now be read by a computer. And in your case, you might find that useful for reading, in particular print works. Might be a bit more difficult with handwriting. But there are software, and if you're interested in that, feel free to contact me to talk more about that. And what I can now do with this machine-readable version, which you see here in the middle, is essentially copy and paste it into a Google Sheets spreadsheet. And what I've done with what I've lovingly called the spreadsheet of doom is expand on the original metadata. So we were just looking at title, author, place and date, etc. And so what I've essentially ended up with is over 100 metadata categories. And that means I can analyze a range of different types of data. And the reason I decided to do that is because, well, there is so much data available on the web about the different people involved with the creation of each book, about the genres as well. So that's something else that I added in, was the genre of every book. In the case of censored books, you might be able to go and find who the actual author was. So this was a great way to add more dimensions to my analysis of the library. At the same time, I had to think about how is my digital approach taking me far away from how Voltaire would have read this book or this library catalog, and how can I recover that original sense of interaction? And one way in which I tried to do that was through using genre classifications that were developed in his lifetime. So that's something else you have to think about, is what interventions are you making? So this data set now allows us to explore Voltaire's library and gain insights that would have been difficult to have without it. And to give you one quick example of what those insights could look like, this is a bird's eye view of the library that is filtered through dates of publication. And so what I did in expanding the metadata categories was include two different types of publication dates. The first is the stated date, so that's the date the catalog tells us is the date of publication for the book. And then I've also included original dates. So let's say you have something like Aristotle. The stated date is 1732, for example, but the original date is like -300. So these two dates, by comparing them, we can get a sense of the temporal distribution of the library. So what you're looking at is stated dates, which go from roughly 1530 all the way up to 1780. But what you get when you plot the original dates is something very different. We have something around -500 all the way up to what is probably 1780, with an absence of medieval texts and ancient ones, well, after 400. And this is something you couldn't have seen just looking at the individual level of books or just flipping through the catalog. So I should also point out the color coding is genre. So we can now drill down into this visualization and ask, where are his books on theology coming from? Where are his books on law coming from? And, add on these layers of interpretation. So this is just one example of how we can use digital tools, in this case a visualization tool and a spreadsheet, to understand an aspect of book history in a new way. So at this stage, I would like for us to take the very first step in transforming our objects into digital artifacts. So using your phone or your tablet, if you've got it with you, I would like for you to take a photo of the title page of your book. So it's the same page you were looking at to find the metadata. And in a little bit, you'll see why exactly we're doing that. So on our next stop, I'm going to open up this digital edition. Oops, let's see if I can get that. Here we go. This very cool digital edition. And if we were in the classroom, I would be having the book itself as well. And I've made a note here to remind you that if you are working with a book while you're watching, make sure to use book pillows and the snakes to hold open your book as you're taking the photograph. Don't force open the spine or try to force open the cover. Just take as good of a photograph as you can without damaging the book. The other thing you want to be really careful to do is include the shelf mark of the book, because you might end up forgetting it, or if you send a picture of it to someone else, they should be able to see where they can find it, as well as a ruler. Because one of the issues with digital artifacts is that we lose a sense of size and materiality. And one way of recovering that is including a ruler, or as well as including your hand to give a sense of size. So what we're going to look at right now is a digital edition, which began with somebody taking a lot of photos of a physical object. And what you can do with those photos is digitize. And if you work with medieval manuscripts, you definitely know a lot about digitization. And so, as you know, of course, we've all been the beneficiaries of digitized objects during this lockdown. But even beyond, necessity, there are many cool things you can do with a digitized book or other kind of object. You can, for example, share it on social media or in a blog post, which we'll talk about in a bit. You can also compare it with other documents for comparing and contrasting using things like a triple IF viewer. Again, this should be something familiar if you work with medieval manuscripts, and you can use it in multimedia presentations as well. So there's really, the opportunities are endless in that way. So what you're looking at right here is a digital edition of a digitized manuscript on the far left. And digital editions, one way to think about them is that they are print texts that have been made digital and in many cases enhanced with digital tools. So what we're going to look at closer here is a digital edition of the Janua Linguarum Reservata. And this is a 17th century Latin textbook. And the title basically means the gate of languages unlocked. And you might be thinking, well, what's the big deal about this very old Latin textbook? Well, it's quite unusual for textbooks of that time. It was developed by the great Czech pedagogue and bishop Johann Amos Comenius, and he wanted to improve the way students learned because he himself had quite an unpleasant experience when he was in school. So what this book does that's innovative is that it structures 1,000 sentences across 100 chapters with 8,000 words of vocabulary. And it moves through those chapters at increasing difficulty. And so it was meant to be a streamlined and efficient way of learning Latin. And it actually became the preferred method of learning Latin across Europe. Even the Princess of Sweden used Comenius's method. So from high school students up to royalty. So what the Taylorian has done is to digitize this manuscript, and they've also included a transcription. So a little bit like what I was doing with the catalog, as well as information about the book, bibliographical information. So this is a great way of viewing the text and comparing it, looking at it closer, so on and so forth. But there's a mystery here with the Janua. Back, I believe it was in January of last year. Sorry, let me just pop through all of these slides. Quick refresher, there we go. So last year, the Taylorian got an email from the bibliographer of the Deutsche Comenius Gesellschaft, and he said, "I've never seen an edition like yours," and essentially suggested this might be a unicum or a unique edition. And The reason why this might be a unique edition is because the majority of editions of the Jaunua are bilingual. Latin was on the one side and the student's native language was on the other. And this was meant to facilitate the process of learning Latin. So if you think about it in your own context, it would be much easier to learn a language if you had the subtitles on, a TV show, for example. So the question I wanted to answer is to figure out, is this book one of a kind? And to do that, I had to establish the basic metadata. And that meant looking across a lot of different editions. The problem is there are so many editions and so many copies because it's such a popular text that you couldn't make your way through all of them even in one lifetime. So I had to find a way of establishing whether this was a unique edition, and one way of doing that was through a digital method. So at this point, I want you to think about, if you were in my shoes, what would you do if you were posed with this project and 8 weeks of a semester to do it? So in the last example, we looked at databases and spreadsheets and visualizations. In this one, we're going to look at social media and crowdsourcing. So what we've got here is the Oxford Book History Twitter account, which I began as part of my coursework last year. And what I decided to do was to ask the people who follow us on Twitter to show us your Jaunua, which I know sounds a bit silly, but it refers to the title of the book. And what I wanted them to do was, go into their libraries and their archives and their institutions and see what editions of the Jaunua they could find and send us a picture. Because doing so would allow me to get a range of editions that I might not have even found looking through a database. And then I could compare the different titles and the different metadata to see, do any of them look like ours? So we're going to just talk a bit about how you can do crowdsourcing through social media and how you might use the Oxford Book History Twitter to do that. So this is the Twitter here. I'm going to see if I can find, show us your Jaunua. Let's see what we've got here. Here we go. So what we started with was a thread. And you've definitely seen these before, but there's a couple of, tricks of the trade to doing a good thread. And actually at this point, since we are all social media gurus as millennials, I'd like for you to think about, in your experience, what makes for a good Twitter thread? Or a good engaging post on the blog, or a good, Facebook post. So think a little bit about that. And in our case, what I was trying to do was grab people's attention. So the way I did that is I started out with the mystery. We believe we might have a unicum, but we don't know. And then I drew people in by saying we're going to be doing an experiment, and I included a very cute GIF on top of that. And in this thread, I briefly explained what the premise of the project was, who Comenius was, why this book is important. I included a few images of it as well. And a great thing to do throughout your thread is to tag people, because it gets their attention, it acknowledges their role in your project, and it helps to disseminate the thread further, which is the whole point. I included links to the editions, and then I draw people into the mystery. I include the original blog post that I wrote about it, which I'll show you in just a second. And I ended with tagging as many people as I could think of so that they could send these out to their followers. And what you see here is that a lot of people actually ended up responding. So this is Magdalen College here in Oxford. From their library, they showed us their Jaunua. We've got this person here who works at the Consortium for European Research Libraries. She sent us a screenshot of their database of the different editions they have. And she pointed out there's none that match ours. And then we've just got a great conversation going here as well. This person, I think, was the MVP of the whole show. He sent so many editions, but none of them matched ours. So the mystery thickened, as it were. So I'm just going to quickly show you the blog post, because what I'm going to encourage you to do, and what Professor Lanneman will encourage you to do as well, is to think about how you can communicate your research questions, goals, and results in new medium. So this is the blog post I wrote up on the History of the Book blog, again started last year as part of my coursework, where I explain the premise of the project. I include images from the digital edition. So this is essentially the Twitter thread, but fleshed out. And I end with the questions that I'm looking at and how to get involved. So this is a really good exercise in translating, high-level academic work into a more accessible forum. So what was the big deal about this? Oh dear, here we are. So what was the big deal about using social media to do this project? The first thing is that it allowed us to build a community that was international and cross-institutional. And you get a sense of that here with the impressions and the engagements of our Twitter thread. So engagements, if I recall correctly, is people actually engaging with the thread, so retweeting it, possibly liking it, and definitely commenting. And impressions, I believe, is how many times it shows up on somebody's timeline. And what you do, what these statistics give you a sense of, is that you're essentially drawing people into conversation who might not otherwise have met. You've got Maudlin, you've got Jesus College, you've got the Warburg Library, and in doing so, you're tapping into these wells of expertise that you might not otherwise have had access to, just sitting inside the Bodleian. And of course, there's a lot of efficiency in pulling this data together, because in some ways you're getting people to do the work for you, but they can also know about things that you might not have found yourself. So at this moment, I would like for you to reflect on, what do you see as the benefits of this unconventional approach, and how might you use it, if at all, for your work? Because social media, you can crowdsource, but you can also, ask for people's opinions, you can share your research, you can talk to different experts in a way that's not email-based. You can find people on Twitter through various hashtags. And actually, Professor Lanneman is a big fan of hashtags. There's some recurring ones. I believe on Monday and Wednesdays, the medievalist community has a hashtag they do for different manuscripts and things of that nature. So you can develop your own online community in new and exciting ways. So I just want to end, this of course, the edition sent by our friend Dominique Stolz, the MVP of the whole project. And what we ended up finding is that there's no edition, at least in this sample size that looks like ours. So the mystery remains open. And so you got a sense of the blog there. So I'm going to just leave this slide up and talk to you a bit more about the History of the Book blog, which, let's see if I can pull that up. That might be better. Here we go. So as a student on the course, you'll have access to the blog, and you'll be encouraged to write up your own posts throughout the duration of your research project. So we start this as a way for students to share their work in new and engaging ways. And I want you to think about the following questions. First, what is the difference between a blog post and a journal article? What can you include in a blog post that you might not be able to include in a journal article? What makes for an engaging blog post based on your own experience? And what are, at least at this stage, what are some of your thoughts about how you might blog about your project? So to give you a sense, we've got blogs here about things that we've done on the course, like going to the Bodleian and doing a manuscript session. So, for example, you can include a video here that you've taken from any of the sessions. You can include different kinds of multimedia, links, of course, your text. You can link to the different objects that you're working on. Others have written up about what they're working on. And it's a great way of summarizing your research and taking a step back from it and thinking, what is the value of this to others? And how can I communicate my excitement about this to a broader audience? This is quite a long blog post. Do not feel intimidated, but it's it's one way of digesting your research. And you can, again, take images of the different sessions, tell people about why this course is so cool. So I do believe this is from this year's cohort. So think about these methods not because you have to do them or because they're necessarily the right thing to do, but because they can help you think about your research and engage with your research objects in new, exciting, engaging, and refreshing ways. And they can help you look at those objects in a different light, either through data-driven approaches, or they can help you share your own excitement about what it is that you do with other people. Because we do this through a belief that these things matter. They matter for the study of the human experience. And digital methods allow us to share that with others. So on that note, go forth, think about your project in new ways, and please do feel free to reach out to me either through email or Twitter. And if you're definitely doing on social media a part of your project, please tag me as well. So thank you for listening and best of luck.